Welcome to Crash Course World History. This is Unit 7 through 8. I'm David Provan, and we're going to start at the beginning of the 1900s. The 1900s began with World War I, which was caused with a bunch of intermingling alliances, militarism, nationalism, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But the really important thing about World War I was it was the first industrial war with the invention of things like machine guns and gas and trench warfare. It left about 16 million people dead by 1918, and the treaty drawn up after it, instead of preventing another world war, actually started sowing the seeds for a second by encouraging German resentment. About a decade after World War I ended, the US stock market crashed, which sent the world into the Great Depression. Banks failed across the country, and millions of people lost their jobs, with employment rates being as high as 25% in some countries. As governments struggled to respond to this economic crisis, in many places people lost faith in democracy, leading to the rise of fascist regimes. And this brings us to World War II, which was deadlier and bigger and more global than the previous World War. World War II left empires in Europe shaken and dramatically quickened decolonization. Countries like India, Indonesia, and nations all across Africa managed to gain independence from Europe. But it wasn't peaceful after that, because there was the partition of India along religious lines, which led to millions of people being displaced. A lot of these newly formed nations had to pick sides between the US and USSR, which often had drastic consequences on their economy and their civilian population, oftentimes leading to proxy wars like in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, Paraguay, Chile, and Ethiopia. Now, after World War II, two superpowers filled in for the fallen European empires, and those were the US and USSR, leading to the Cold War, which my associate Daniel will now explain for you.
So the first thing you need to know is Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German philosopher, and he was exceedingly influential in communist circles, developing Marxism as an ideology, which was used in the Russian 1917 revolution. So to set the scene for the revolution, as you know, 1917, tail end of World War I, Russia is not having a great time. There's starvation, everything is bad. Germans are pushing hard, and so people start to not really like the aristocracy. And a general revolution overthrows the Tsar, and out of it, a group called the Bolsheviks, run by Vladimir Lenin, managed to take control of the country after a long civil war. They bring Russia out of the war by signing the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and create the first communist country in Europe, the Soviet Union. Now, to now, the second nation to talk about is China. Now, the Chinese Communist Party came about after the Russians, emerging in about 1921 after the fall of the imperial Chinese system, which gave way to the Republic of China in 1911. Now, the Chinese Communist Party was originally very small and often had conflicts with the Kuomintang, which was the Chinese Nationalist Party. But as World War II came to China in 1937 with the Second Sino-Japanese War, the communists gained massive support among the rural populace through fighting the Japanese and not killing civilians like the Kuomintang did. And this led, after the war ended, to the Chinese Communist Party being able to make a resurgence and eventually defeating the Nationalist Party, forcing them to flee to Taiwan. Now, both nations wanted to quickly industrialize, and in the Soviet Union, you see several like 5-year plans come into play run by Joseph Stalin, which led to a large amount of heavy industry. And in China, they mostly followed the Soviet plan. And another thing that both nations did was collectivize farms. But the Chinese had a lot easier time with this because they'd already built up trust with the rural land base, and whereas the Soviets didn't, and thus ended up killing a lot of kulaks, which were richer Soviet peasants at the time. However, the collectivization process in either nation did not really end up well, and both nations suffered terrible famines which killed millions of people. Such as, for example, the Great Leap Forward, which was the Chinese Communist Party's attempt to industrialize, which saw some great initial success until they started making peasants like smelt steel in their backyards, which ended up backfiring because they shipped all the food to cities and had massive starvation issues. Now, notably, both of these countries had a relatively modern view on women, allowing them to work, and they had many of the same freedoms that men had at the time, mainly in the Soviet Union, where women served in the army in World War II. Now, through the Cold War, cracks started to begin to show in the communist system, which will be discussed in next chapter. But essentially, there were two ways that the communist nations would develop, shown by China and the Soviet Union. Now, China, particularly, ended up going through a series of reforms led by Deng Xiaoping, who allowed a lot more cultural and economic liberties within the Chinese state, particularly like more capitalist policies like freedom to own businesses and such, whilst the Chinese Communist Party retained their complete authoritarian control over the government. In the late 1900s, the Soviet Union was in a bit of a rough spot economically, and the people were beginning to want to have more freedoms, especially in the Warsaw Pact Eastern Bloc nations. And that's when Mikhail Gorbachev became leader of the Soviet Union, who implemented policies of perestroika and glasnost, which gave freedoms to the economy and freedoms to culture separately. And in essence, the Soviet state completely collapsed as the Warsaw Pact states broke away and declared independence, along with certain portions of the Soviet Union, breaking it up into a bunch of smaller states like Belarus, Kazakhstan, the Russian Federation, and the Baltic countries.